Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to this Climate Change and Health webinar, The Challenge for Neurology. To introduce myself, I'm Janet Mifsud. I'm a clinical pharmacologist from Malta with a special interest in epilepsy, and I am presently co-chair for Task Force 2, which is Sustainable Engagement within the Climate Change Commission within ILA. And it is truly my great honor to welcome you to chair this meeting today. As you can see, I have no conflicts of interest to declare. First of all, the usual housekeeping, as with all webinars. Please use the Q&A function to send us any questions and comments. These will be answered at the end of the webinar, when there will be time for presentations for discussion. And we also would like to remind you, it will be repeated several times during the webinar, that after the webinar, you will be invited to participate in a survey which the Climate Change Commission has organized on climate change. And we do hope you will participate in the survey yourself. So to start, as you know, climate change is with us. As professionals in neurology who place value on evidence-based practice and climate change, it's something we cannot ignore. Links between climate change and neurological conditions are likely to be multifactorial, complex, and often indirect. Identifying climate change-driven altered risks would help us to develop evidence for better mitigation methods to protect persons from neurological disorders, to understand better the effects of climate change. This webinar, which originally started as an idea by the Climate Change Commission, for today, which is International Climate Change Day, also has the support actually of two other world federations who are also working on climate change. So we're really pleased that it is actually being organized in conjunction with the Environmental Neurology Specialty Group within the World Federation of Neurology and the Task Force of Sustainability, Climate Change Effects, Transformation Design of the European Academy of Neurology. So the main objectives of this webinar, and I hope you will, as I said, learn as we learn, and we hope that this is just the beginning of the discussion, will be to develop a broad agenda with neurological colleagues, recognize how climate change can impact your patients and practice, and identify opportunities to engage in research and mitigate impacts. We have a very busy schedule ahead of us. We will start with a welcome from the three presidents. Afterwards, we'll hear an address by climate change researchers, and we will also launch an interactive poll, which will help hopefully to stimulate the discussion. Following that, we'll have the perspective of a patient, and then the perspective from the three neurological associations, followed by information on the survey I mentioned earlier. We will have some time for Q&A and for panel discussions, and finally, the concluding remarks by Professor Sanjay Sisodia, who is the chair for the Climate Change Commission. So without much ado, I invite now I proceed by inviting Professor Helen Kloss, the President of the International League Against Epilepsy, to give us her opening address.
Hello, I'm Helen Kloss, and I'm the President of the International League Against Epilepsy. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the first joint webinar to celebrate World Climate Day and focus on the likely impacts of climate change on people with epilepsy and other neurological disorders. Climate change is undeniable. Since the early 1960s, average global temperatures have risen each decade. The planet is, without doubt, getting hotter and hotter. The climate crisis is now the biggest challenge facing humanity. It will affect us all in many foreseen and unforeseen ways. Much is known about it already, and there are many actions we can take. We do, however, need to invest in understanding more about its potential impacts for people with neurological diseases, including epilepsy, and more research into this area is needed. But based on what we already know, it is likely that having a neurological disease will increase vulnerability to the effects of climate change. At the beginning of my term as president of the International League Against Epilepsy, I was eager to ensure that we are doing as much as we can as an organisation to understand and address these challenges. The Climate Change Commission began its work 18 months ago and has been very active advising us on how to reduce the carbon footprint of the International League, ways to engage with other organisations to learn more, as well as engage in a sustainable manner. They have also been active in reviewing how we support more research into the impact of climate change on people with epilepsy and other neurological disorders, whilst also making the research we do as sustainable and climate friendly as possible. I am really pleased to see so many people participating in this webinar and look forward to learning more about this topic.
My name is Dr. Wolfgang Griswold, and I'm the president of the World Federation of Neurology. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to this joint ILE, EAN, and WFN webinar with the topic on the International Climate Change Day. The World Federation has a specialty group engaged in environment for many years, and also had a World Brain Day on Environment in 2018, which at this time was met with skeptical remarks from some societies who considered this as not appropriate. Climate is part of environmental changes, and it's part of a larger basket that has to do with toxicity, pollution, clean air, and many other topics. The special focus of this meeting is climate change and epilepsy, and the task of this community is to delineate and research on evidence and on progress of knowledge. This can be difficult in times when many events, or almost all events, are linked to climate change and environmental change, and is a very responsive task. The WHO, WFN Specialty Group on Environment will also hold a session at our World Congress in Montreal on environment, and we also have this year's topic, brain health and disability, which is also closely linked to environment and climate. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Cross and Professor Griswold, for those welcoming remarks. And I would like to add that Professor Paul Boom, who was the president of the European Academy of Neurology, has also sent his very best regards. So now to the actual data. As the first speaker, I'm really pleased that we have with us Dr. Stephen Blankeskop, who is also a member of the Climate Change Commission. Stephen is a senior lecturer at the School of Engineering at Newcastle University. He is a climate change scientist whose research interests include historical trends and variability in extreme weather events. He's also interested in climate impacts and risks and understanding how these risks impact society, infrastructure, health, and how might change in the future. This talk will look at the challenge, a perspective from a climate change researcher. Can I kindly remind you, if you do have any Q&A or any comments, please don't hesitate to put them in the chat box, in the relevant chat box, and they will be answered at the end of the question. So over to you, Stephen.
Thank you, Janet. I'll just share my slides. Okay, hopefully they're visible now. Yeah, thank you for letting me speak. And really, I just want to start off really with a contemporary reminder of the scale of the issue that we're seeing playing out at the moment. Just last month, we saw record-breaking temperatures in Spain, where we saw the April temperature record, not really just broken, but broken by quite some margin, which you can see on the graph there. Temperatures previously not experienced in Spain. And we're seeing this pattern really repeated around the world. We had last summer's heat wave across large parts of Europe. And we're also seeing increases in extreme rainfall, lead to flooding, and other hazards as well. I really wanted to start it off by saying that we've actually come a long way, and far from being climate alarmism, as is often alleged, what we're seeing is the steady accumulation of evidence from research and data. So what I did is I tracked back through successive UN IPCC reports to see what the headline messages were on human-caused climate change. And actually back in 1990, in the first report, you can see there, they actually concluded that there was little evidence for a detectable human influence on climate. But as we've sort of progressed, as we've increased our analysis, added data, you can see by the fourth report, we're able to sort of make a revised statement there saying most of the observed increase in temperatures is actually because of anthropogenic greenhouse gas concentrations. And if we come to the latest, the sixth assessment report published in 2021, we can actually see a really strong statement there. They're saying it's unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere and land since pre-industrial times. So it's a really strong statement, and that's come account because of accumulation of knowledge, of evidence through more data, through better understanding of climate processes, and improved models of the global climate system. So we've actually come a long way. What are the health impacts of climate change? Well, other people are going to speak more to this. I just really want to say that they're wide-ranging, from the direct impacts, things like extreme heat affecting heat stroke, changes in the distribution of vector-borne diseases like malaria, but also impact on things like indirectly through malnutrition and access to water. And these aren't going to be, key point is that these aren't going to be played out evenly. So you can see there, this isn't actually a manipulated figure. This is two areas of housing, one next to the other. And there are really huge disparities we see in terms of the impacts of climate on health that will be affected by differences in socioeconomic status, in gender, and in race. And so what we really need to do is think about the wider issues highlighted by the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So to tackle the impact of climate crisis on health, we need to think about things like poverty, about hunger, about education, and about gender inequalities. So we need to think very, very widely about how we address this. But in terms of what we do need to achieve, then many people have heard of the Paris Agreement, and this was the overall goal for the planet to increase, that the increase in global mean temperature should be limited to no more than 2 degrees, and if possible to significantly below, and to try and limit it to 1.5 degrees. The problem is we're already well down that road. Since pre-industrial times, the planet's already warmed by about 1.1, 1.2 degrees centigrade. So we're well on that track. And as you can see in the figure on the right, the atmosphere, the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere continues to increase. And these were the very latest figures I pulled out just a week or two ago. So we can see there's a lot of work still to be done if we're to reduce our emissions to limit that warming. So the health sector, like the rest of society, has a role to play. And here, this is just a figure from a paper looking at greenhouse gas emissions from a hospital in Switzerland. And you can see there, perhaps no surprises, emissions stemming from heating, from electricity use, from building infrastructure, catering. But we also need to think about the downstream effects that perhaps we don't have direct control over. So things like the pharmaceutical sector. And we did some interesting work during the pandemic in the Commission looking at the improvements that could be made in terms of emissions through telemedicine and remote clinics, and the emissions that could be saved by that. So we need to think creatively as to how we can reduce these emissions across a wide range of features of the medical sector. But a sustainable healthcare and sustainable health isn't just about reducing our emissions. We also need to adapt to climate change. And this was the results of a survey that went out to UK hospitals after the heat wave last year. And you can see almost 20% reported that the heat wave directly resulted in the cancellation of elective surgery. And this was because of staff shortages due to illness, through overheating theatre environments. And also in one hospital, it caused the overheating of the entire IT infrastructure. That meant that they had no computer support. And obviously that had a really significant effect on their ability to deliver healthcare. So what we need to do is we need to have a good hard think about how we adapt to the future hazards, so how people's homes are adapted to increased temperatures, but also our healthcare system and settings as well are adapted to that extreme heat in the future, but also other hazards as well. So we could produce similar information on flooding, which has affected a number of hospitals in the UK. If that becomes more problematic in the future, then we need to think how we can adapt to that. So really the take home then is that we need a twin-pronged attack. We need mitigation, so reducing our emissions, and adaptation. And this is just to illustrate that. This is just the projections of the future. This is for London in the UK, of how likely it is we will issue a heat health alert. So these are heat alerts that will affect people's health. And under 4 degrees of warming by the end of the century, we will see that the probability of getting one of these heat alerts will be up to 67%. So a very, very high likelihood that we'll get these under unmitigated warming of 4 degrees. But if we actually take that action that I talked about, that if we limit our warming to 2 degrees centigrade, we can see there that impact, that percentage chance of getting these extreme heat events is actually significantly reduced. So by taking this action on mitigation and reducing our emissions, we can have a positive effect on our patients and on wider society and on the health of the public, because we're less likely to get these events that put pressure on their health and pressure on the healthcare system. And the final point really is to say that we're already some way down that road. So in addition to that mitigation, we actually need to think about how we adapt. We've already locked in to some of this warming, so we need to think how we can make people's homes so that they're robust to increases in temperature, and our healthcare settings as well, so that when these events do become more likely in the future, as they will, then we don't have the sort of disruption that we're currently seeing. And again, that applies to other hazards as well, so things like flooding as well. So not only new infrastructure, so new hospitals, but we also need to think about how we retrofit existing healthcare settings as well. So I think that concludes really what I wanted to say at that point. So I'll hand over back to Janet.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Those are, I think you really set the scene now for what we're planning to do next, which is now your interventions. So we decided to do a little poll, a Zoom poll. I'm sure you're all familiar now with using these. So I invite Jessica from the International League to launch the poll so I can read out questions. We just have 3 short questions, and here they are. And I'll just read them out quickly. It won't take long, and just choose what you think, in your opinion, is the correct answer. So the first one: depending on the level of greenhouse emissions, the global average temperatures are expected to rise by how many degrees by 2100? So it's 0.5 to 1 degree Fahrenheit, and put them for the convenience of our US colleagues both in Fahrenheit and Celsius. So it's or 0.25 to 0.5 degrees Celsius. They will not increase, they will increase. Or is it 2 to 11.5 degree Fahrenheit, was around 1 to 5 degrees Celsius? So you can answer now. Okay, can you see the results, please? Ah, very good. So actually, the majority of you did choose the correct answer, which is, frighteningly enough, the largest increase, which is around 1 to 5 degrees Celsius or 2 to 11.5 degree Fahrenheit. So that is actually quite a substantial number. So next question. So based on your professional experience or professional expertise or experience, to what extent do you think neurological conditions are affected by weather climate extremes? We've heard the experience in the UK and what happened in their hospitals. So is it not at all, to some extent, to a significant extent, or don't know? So allow a few seconds for you to answer that question. So here we don't have any right or wrong answers, just your personal experience. We'll be hearing now about personal experiences. So in your personal experience, okay, can we see the answer? It seems it's a mix. Some people don't know, some to some extent, and some to a significant extent. So it means we actually need to do something. There are experiences out there, and we need to see what we can do with these experiences. So our last question for this brief poll is this: do you personally take some actions, such as changing transportation habits or reducing energy consumption at home to reduce carbon emissions? So is it never, sometimes, often, always? So what do you all do? Can you do something? Are you doing something? Are you pressurized by your children or kids to do something? I think we can see the results now. So it's a mixed field as well. So sometimes, often, always. It'll be interesting actually to see what is the reason for the sometimes, often, always, and is our infrastructure allowing us or is it not? So this is something which we'll have to think about shortly. Thanks very much. So I do hope it will just set food for thought. So now it's time to hear the patient perspective on climate change. Would not be here without patients. And there have been a great deal of anecdotal evidence from patients with different types of epilepsy, saying that experiences in climate change conditions have affected their seizures. So I'm really pleased that with us today we have Mr. Jose Angel Aybar, who's the president of the Fundación Síndrome de Dravet Spain, who is going to give us his insight, his personal experience on climate change and epilepsy. Jose.
Thank you very much for the introduction and for letting me share here the experience of not only myself but also of some of the families I have been talking to. And yes, to introduce my session, I wanted just to share this map which is not actually too old, was only 10 days ago. So I'm originally from Nice. Sorry, I currently live in Nice in France, but I'm originally from Sevilla, southern Spain, where you see 10 days ago we almost reached the 40 Celsius degrees, and because of that, I tried to talk to some families with Dravet syndrome to try to understand how the climate change and the heat waves are impacting them, how they are impacting in their day-to-day life, and in conclusion, we try to group the impact in 4 major blocks, which you can see there. The first one here, it's a susceptibility to more seizure. I even had the feedback from some families, in Dravet syndrome. It's a rare epilepsy which starts in the first year of life. When patients reach the adulthood, they may have long periods without seizures. So some of the families even reported that those long periods without seizure came to an end because of the temperature. So susceptibility to more seizures, which is somehow linked as well to the sleep issue. When it's 28 or 30 degrees, sleeping might not be so easy or simple. And because they are having sleep issues, they might have also as well more seizures during the day. And also, this is also impacting the caregivers' quality of life. The third block, which is, less time outdoors. And when I say less time outdoors, it's not only outdoors, but also outside home. What we perceive or what we have seen is that many infrastructures, such as schools and so on, they are not really prepared for the heat waves. And when there is such a temperature outside, people or the patients need to stay home. They cannot even go to the rehabilitation centers or to the school because of that. No, and this is of course having a negative impact on the behavior and quality of life. We by the way reported a similar issue during the COVID lockdowns. We published a paper 2 years ago, and one of the key takeaways was that the lockdowns were impacting the patient's behavior. And this is happening more or less the same with climate change. And the last block, we identified the home adaptations. Many families had to make adaptation to their homes, including insulation and installing air conditioning, and that's also impacting the most vulnerable people, because if they don't have the resources to make those adaptations, they will not be in a very good position. And families also reported those families who made the proper adaptation to have AC at home, maybe in most of the room. They also reported significant electricity cost due to having to run the AC almost 24 hours a day. So that's also impacting the financial burden of the disease. And here, as you see, all these 4 blocks are impacting the already existing disease burden, which is quite significant in Dravet syndrome. So these are the 4 blocks we identify, and then moving forward is what can we do as a patient organization. We have a climate change in front of us. That's something we cannot now deny, and we are trying to see from our organization what can we do as a patient organization. So the first point, we need to better understand what climate change and the heat waves entails to the Dravet syndrome community. That's the reason why this summer we want to launch a study in collaboration with Dr. Aledo Serrano to understand the impact of the climate change in the Dravet syndrome community in Spain. We also need to raise awareness about the impact of climate change on the health of people with Dravet syndrome and their families, and this event is a fantastic opportunity. We, of course, have to promote and support adaptation to climate change among patients with Dravet syndrome and their caregivers. We have to see how we can support our community. You know, in our foundation, we have a program which is aimed at providing some financial support for some therapies. We are now considering whether we should open this for home adaptations and other type of work to fight against climate change. And of course, the last but not least, the final point, we have to collaborate with other social, health, and environmental organizations to demand urgent and ambitious actions to mitigate climate change. And that's the reason why in our foundation, we are part of both Fundaciones por el Clima here in Spain and Philanthropy for Climate internationally. And then I thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Jose. That was really an insightful perspective, and I think there's a lot which we need to do together, both the medical staff, the scientists, and the patients' organization. We need to tackle this problem. So we're really pleased to have had you on board with us today. So next speaker, again, I remind you that if you do have any comments, even just comments or personal experiences you wish to share, please don't forget to jot them down in the Q&A. So the next speaker, I'm really pleased to present Professor Jacques Ries from France, who's a member of the Environmental Neurology Specialty Group of the World Federation of Neurology. We're so pleased to have WFN with us on board today. Professor Ries is a neurologist with a special interest in environmental medicine. He's presently Professor Conventionat at the University of Strasbourg, where he has been teaching environmental medicine since 2009, as well as a faculty member in the universities of Luxembourg, Istanbul, and Uppsala. Professor Ries will be sharing his experience on neurological impact of climate change. Professor Ries.
Thank you much.
I think you have to put it in presentation mode, Professor Ries.
Yes, do you hear me? Yes. Okay. Thank you very much for your kind introduction.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
And very pleased to attend your meeting and to contribute to this meeting. I think it is a very important question. You have a reason, and I think it's very useful for everybody to listen at this conference today. I will come back to the release of the sixth assessment report of the IPCC in March. And as you see, this release, this report tackle two main questions, with the state of knowledge of science of climate change, and also report about the results of the two working groups, the three working groups which tackle physical science, impact, and mitigation. And my first comment is to point that the health impact of climate change is not the most important aspect of this report, and it's among four other important issues, which are water availability, infrastructures and settlement, biodiversity, and ecosystem. And as when we consider health, we have to deal with all these issues in this great concern, and not only with what we call diseases. I would also point that I will address today only the direct effect of the climate change, and I will not speak about, for example, the agriculture production and its yield, neither of the causes of climate change, for example, air pollution, which has a tremendous impact on health also. It's another issue. So I come back to the definition of climate change, and I would point that climate change has a precise definition, as you see, but also two different conditions related to climate change, which as a scientific and world agrees now. First, the chronic changes, which is global warming, and we have spoken from this aspect, and another aspect, which has a acute effect of the climate change, which are extreme events. And extreme events were not recognized at the beginning by the IPC as being directly linked to the climate change, because some meteorological events have been seen before we can speak about climate change. I would also point to the fact that the WFN concern about climate change is an old mission, I would say, and we started with climate change in one session in 2011 in Marrakesh, and we spoke about environmental, what the neurologists should know about climate change. The climate change definition, as you see, is global warming. Global warming is average of everything, but you see that the most important thing is that average does not mean for everybody the same. What we see on this slide are two maps showing that the distribution of the global warming is very heterogeneous on the Earth's surface, either land or sea. And you see there is another phenomenon which is very important, is the Arctic amplification in the northern hemisphere. So global warming is not the same for everybody. Second important thing about climate change are extreme events. And you see the multiplicity of the different kind of extreme events. Drought, floods, giant forest, desert storm, lightning, which occur more and more often. And this is a very important thing because it shows also that a characteristic of climate change is to provoke a dysregulation of the climate and ends with the stability of the climate. The climate is becoming chaotic on Earth. So what are the impacts? I think that we have to deal with two different aspects of the climate change. First, the first one are extreme events. They produce some non-specific kind of diseases or injuries, as you see, for example, brain trauma, which is great concern for neurologists, heat stroke, lightning, and each of these illness has a direct impact This has a direct impact for neurologists. We have also psychological post-traumatic stress disorders, which can often happen with these extreme events. Another aspect is when extreme events occur, they may provoke disasters. For example, when they hit plants with chemical or industrial plants, and they provoke intoxication and also poisoning, which is an important aspect. As you see, Hurricane Katrina produced monoxide carbon poisoning in 2005 when it occurs. Another aspect is outbreaks of infectious diseases, and a very known example are waterborne infection induced by El Nino Southern Oscillation, and in El Nino is a phenomenon which occurs very often in the Western Pacific, including Australia, and which hits South America and Central Pacific America. When you consider now global warming, it means that there is an unusual high temperature in usually climate-friendly areas. For example, in Siberia, the temperature hit the record of more than 30 degrees. So of course, we have to consider the former situation when you are speaking about global warming. Nobody would expect such temperature, for example, in the Arctic. And what is also a direct effect of this average warming is melting of ice, and melting of ice not only in mountains, but also in the Arctic, which has a direct consequence, drawing when people use to cross lakes with different kinds of transportation. And it is not still possible because the ice cover is shortening. The other impact of global warming is to modify the distribution on insect vectors and animal hosts and intermediates, and allowed invasive species to propagate across the world. It was a kind for a lot of vectors coming to the USA, to Europe, for example, coming from Asia or from the Middle East. And what is also very important to consider this climate change, temperature, and also humidity can favor the life cycle of this pathogen. Another aspect is what is called harmful algae blooms, which may produce many toxins and sometimes may lead to color seas and lakes. It's what's called right tide. Of course, this has a very important impact on human in general, but the question is, who is the most impact of all this population? There is not the same when we consider healthy adults and when we consider vulnerable population as children, senior, and of course, our patient. And this has two different aspects. We can consider that climate change has a causal effect triggering a pathology, as we have seen, but also worsening susceptible condition of our patient, for example. And of course, extreme event and heat wave, for example, have a higher burden for people having Alzheimer's disease, dementia, Parkinson, and so on. So it's very important to see that our patients are more susceptible to be impacted by climate change in these two aspects, global warming and extreme events.
Professor Rees, just to remind you, you have just 2 minutes left. Sorry, but we have a very tight agenda. So 2 minutes. I know you have some slides left. Thank you.
Okay. Now, I will end this and to say we experiment nowadays already climate change, and it's very important to address this issue for our vulnerable patients. Thank you much.
Thank you so much, and sorry for stopping you early, but we do have a very tight agenda, and we do wish to have all the interventions. Hopefully next time we'll be able to have more time to share this presentation. Thank you so very much, Professor Rees. So now it's the turn of our colleague from the European Academy of Neurology. Professor Ulf Kalwit, is a member of the task force on sustainability, climate change effects, and transformation designs of the European Academy of Neurology. He's a professor of narcolepsy and at the University of Wittenherdegg in Germany. In addition, he's consulting research professor in Stratford University. His main areas of scientific interest focus on translation and clinical aspects of sleep. And recently, he's also been working on the impact of climate change in these areas. So Professor Ulf Kalwit will talk to us about the impact of global warming on neurological disorders. Ulf, thank you.
Yeah, Professor Mifsud, dear colleagues, thank you very much for the invitation. It's my pleasure to be part of this event. I will just start to share my screen. Okay. So we heard a lot about that climate change will have a major impact on our health in the future. as there is no health without brain health, more attention to brain health is also needed. And in our EAN brain health concept, which you can see here in a nutshell, also aspects of climate change are addressed. And you see that we're talking about environmental aspects, we're talking about air quality or healthy food, which all are part to preserve or to protect our brain health. This brain health strategy has a holistic approach with one brain, one life, one approach, and consists of several pillars you can see here. And I just want to mention that in all of them, we already see that climate change and transformation aspects are included. So what we do is we want to foster and support also research, not only about brain health, but also about climate change effects on brain health and other aspects. So we also have a large number of young colleagues, residents, even students, and we also want to, and we will address these aspects as part of our educational tasks in the future. So, but of course, as for our own society, we have to look for sustainability aspects, and this is what we do when we are talking about changing processes or selecting partners for our suppliers. And also for our congresses, we changed our offering in terms of travels or catering or materials or the use of digital services. So this figure very nicely from CDC in the USA shows the impact of climate change in different areas and in different fields. And just mentioning here rising temperatures and the more extreme weathers, as my dear colleague has presented before, will be an essential part of this. And actually all parts of neurology are affected by these parts, and I only today would like to mention a few examples here. So when we're talking about stroke, and we have a lot of data indicating that these extreme events like extreme cold or extreme hot are resulting in an increased risk for stroke and for stroke mortality. So you can see here data, these are data from China indicating that extreme cold increases the risk to up to 1.5 or extreme hot 1.13 or less. Data here in the middle shown from Switzerland indicated rising the maximum daytime temperature higher than 30 degrees Celsius rapidly increases stroke mortality. This is probably due to either hypertension also or arrhythmias, which are increasing also above these temperatures, or dehydration or the consequences of dehydration. Interesting from data from Spain, from the southern part of Spain, also indicate, and you can see here in these graphs with the, let's say, light gray dots are the dots of the daytime minimum, so lowest temperature also at night, and the dark gray dot spots during the day. And you can see here all over the days, and also the conclusion of these colleagues are that not probably only the maximum temperatures are relevant, but also the minimum temperature, so 25 degrees at night, probably have a high impact on the number of emergencies or also resulting or stroke cases. So again, data from here, Asia, putting together data from Japan, China, and South Korea. And one aspect, of course, is different geographical distribution we have. And you see that probably China is more affected by higher temperatures than other countries. But again, higher than 30 degrees, there's an increase of stroke cases or relative risk to do so. Interestingly, these colleagues also calculated and projected the part of the stroke cases which will be let's say, heat related. And according different scenarios which have been calculated, and as it has been presented before, we are currently more on the red line, so which one of the not so good scenarios. And you can see that up to maybe 10% of the stroke patients in the future, so in 2090 or something, will be directly heat related. And so this is a major impact on our stroke management and also in the prevention of stroke. I would like to give you another example about infectious diseases. So you're very well aware of tick-borne, and you see here the map on the eastern part of North America, and in red it is marked where tick habitat currently is. You can see here current, and actually this is an old publication, but so you can see 2020, and you see the increasing habitat of tick that we're covering large part of northeastern North America in 2080. This, you can calculate this directly, will have an increase, of course, of CNS infections such as tick-borne encephalitis or also borreliosis. We have been talking a lot, and we often see these figures about, let's say, the changes in average temperatures during the day. But we often somehow neglect that, of course, these changes also occur at night. And in the figure here below, you can see that the change in average temperature and coldest nights will be in the northern hemisphere between, let's say, 3 to 8 degrees Celsius. And this, of course, I'm sorry. Of course, poor sleep, we are very well of this, results from harm and what nights. And there are many publications, and this is just one of the first one from the 90s, indicating the impact of hot night temperatures, total sleep time reduced, more wakefulness, fragmentation of sleep, and of course less deep sleep or REM sleep. And also from our colleague before, the speaker before, we heard about from the patient's view that this fragmentation of night has an impact on, let's say, the frequency of seizures. We also see that the amount of bad nights, to say so, but nights with insufficient sleep due to hot temperatures are calculated, let's say, to rise up to 10 to 15 nights per month in the future without, let's say, following the climate change and warming. And this is something which also has been addressed, will affect in particular people with low income because they cannot afford to have an air condition, and also the older people, and also, I may say, people with chronic and several chronic disorders. Insufficient sleep is not just bad sleep, as we heard before. It may increase the number of seizures, but we also know about all the other consequences of insufficient sleep, not only on the body, but also on the brain, and also on the neuroplasticity, on the rehabilitation process, on memory, on cognition, and others. So just to summarize this part, so brain health strategies need and include already climate change and climate change effects. The global warming will increase the amount of neurological disorders and deteriorate existing diseases in different ways in the different areas. We also have to consider brain development and neuroplasticity may be affected. So from the baby or the child development of the brain, and as I have addressed, neuroplasticity also following bad sleep and other aspects will be affected. And overall, our health system, and in particular, as we're talking here about neurology, neurological care, will be challenged. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Calvet, for that, for the data. And it's interesting to see how you've included perspective from other neurological disciplines and its possible impact as well on epilepsy, and very, very interesting. I do remind our participants to please put in Q&As in the chat. We already have some very interesting questions coming up, relevant actually to the first two speakers. So now it's the turn of our colleagues from the Climate Change Commission. Climate change is something which does not affect only Europe, as the majority of the speakers have heard so far come from, but affects a great deal the rest of the world. So we do have our two colleagues, one from the Philippines, one from India, and we'll be hearing what is happening in their own countries at the grassroots level with respect to climate change. So it's my great pleasure, first of all, to introduce Dr. Bernadette Macaron, who's the head of the Brain and Spinal Unit and a medical specialist in neurology in the Department of Pediatrics at Zamboanga City Medical Center in the Philippines, will be giving us her perspective and her experience of what's happening in her country. Bernadette.
Thank you very much, Janet. Good afternoon, everybody. Good evening. So let me share my slide. So this is my declaration. So there was a time a few years ago, one of our politicians said the Philippines had one of the lowest carbon emissions. Therefore, we shouldn't be instituting measures to mitigate climate change. However, he has a very limited view regarding the effect of climate change in the entire world and not just by country. So being in the Philippines, which is an archipelago, this is the area where I live in. It's basically not just coastal. We don't just have a lot of, or a very long coastline. We also have a lot of mountainous regions, especially in the center of the islands. Therefore, there's this very big challenge, especially in this area, where they have to travel through mountainous regions, as well as to travel from one island to the other. If you look at my region, we have a lot of small islands that would eventually have to go to Zamboanga City, which is the health center of the entire region. And the challenges would include, first, by land. We have a lot of mountainous regions with cliffs and ravines, and the duration of travel by bus can take up to 10 hours. And we have to deal with landslides and floods every time it rains. And by sea, we are very, very much dependent on the weather, which will eventually affect the ferry schedules. And the travel can take up to 26 hours to 1.5 days from one of the farthest islands. And of course, because of this, we have a lot of financial challenges. So the travel budget that a person from one of the islands should consider would be the fares, the overnight hotel stay, which is the shortest, and of course, the food allowance. On top of that, they have to buy medicines that would be good for 4 to 6 months, which is up until their next checkup. And they would bring home the entire hoard of medications just so they don't need to have to come to Zamboanga City. And of course, other medical expenses like blood chemistries, where we have to do when we put them on prolonged medication. And of course, when they have companions, especially for children, we have to consider the budget for them as well. Now, this was taken from my dashboard last May 1. At 12 noon, we reached up to 40 degrees, and this was the actual temperature. If we talk about feels like the heat index, on that day, it was up to 44 degrees Celsius. So it was really very hot. So let's talk about climate change in Zamboanga City. This is the area that I'm talking about. And last March, we clocked in the highest mean temperature in the country, 29.2 degrees. So that was last March. If you compare it in May, where I experienced 40 degrees, that's a very, very big jump. However, talking about jumps, let's see the last 30 years. In the last 30 years, if we compare our temperature last March, again, we were above the 30-year mean by 0.5 to 2 degrees Celsius. So it was really very, very high, very big jump from the 30-year mean. And let's talk about rain. If you look at January to March, our rainfall is very low. However, these videos were taken actually from our dash cameras, and you can see the floods that we experienced in January when the rainfall was expected to be low. But by March, rainfall was way, way below the 30-year normal. So again, the effect of climate change in our area is quite drastic already. So the new challenges that we face now, like for example, last January, there was delayed medical attention due to flooding and landslides. So a lot of our patients had seizures at home, but they weren't brought to the emergency room because of the flooding. And even us doctors weren't able to reach the hospital on time. And since March, we have had reports of increased breakthrough seizures. For example, I had a toddler with DE, was seizure-free for 1 year while living in a very, very rural island in Jolo. And he was transferred to Zamboanga City in March, and then he had breakthrough seizures. I had a 9-year-old boy who was seizure-free for 2 years and had recurrences 3 weeks ago. And I had one girl with LGS who was living in the Middle East, was seizure-free for a year, came home for a holiday, spent 2 days on the beach, and then had seizure recurrences. So what do we think of all of this? So the hypotheses for these recurrences, you were thinking like, maybe it's from dehydration from the heat. And some have already complained that when they opened up the blister packs of their medications, the actual tablets have melted already. There also could be physical stress from the heat, the lack of sleep, and the direct effect of heat on neuronal mechanisms of seizures, which of course, we still have a lot of learning to do. So in summary, climate change has definitely produced deeper and more challenges in our region, and extreme weather changes worsens access to epilepsy care, especially in our area where we really, really depend on the weather to decide on our plans for travel. Therefore, new strategies should be adopted to cope with these challenges. For example, medication storage, cooling strategies, developing other strategies for healthcare deliveries, and so on. So thank you very much for your attention to this short talk. So Janet. Thank you, Janet.
Thank you very much, Bernadette. My computer froze for a couple of seconds. Really lots of food for thought. And actually in the chat, we already have some questions about personal experience of people who were either on holiday or experienced these huge changes in temperature and actually had breakthrough seizures. So we can discuss that further in the Q&A. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Priyanka Madan, who's Assistant Professor of Pediatric Neurology, Amrita Institute of Medical Sciences in Faridabad, India, who has a special interest in pediatric epilepsy and non-epileptic events. And she'll be discussing any studies, any impact on climate change on epilepsy. Priyanka.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Janet, for the kind introduction. I'll just share my slides. I'm very glad to be part of this program. So I would be speaking on climate change and epilepsy. I have no conflict of interest in relation to this program and presentation. So beginning with climate change. So as mentioned by previous speakers, and as we all know that climate change and global warming are for real. Humans and environments are intricately connected, and it is actually a give and take relationship. What we give to environment and earth we get back in some or the other form. So a word about epilepsy. A person is considered to have epilepsy if any of the below criteria is met. So first one being at least 2 unprovoked or reflex seizures occurring more than 24 hours apart. Second one being 1 unprovoked seizure and probability of future occurrence of seizures similar to recurrence risk of at least 60% as in unprovoked seizures, as in more than 2 unprovoked seizures. And diagnosis of epilepsy syndrome. So if we carefully look at this definition, reflex seizures are an important part of this definition. And this signifies the importance of triggers for seizures, which can be intrinsic or extrinsic triggers. So among the endogenous factors or the intrinsic triggers, we have sleep deprivation, which is a common trigger for some genetic generalized epilepsies. Then stress, which can be a trigger for JME. Body temperature, which is a known trigger for Dravet syndrome. So higher temperatures can lead to precipitation of seizures. Hormonal changes, which are a known trigger for catamenial epilepsy. Then fasting, which is a trigger for GLUT1 epilepsy syndrome, and eating can also be a trigger for some developmental and epileptic encephalopathies. Among the exogenous factors are climatic factors like ambient temperature, humidity, and atmospheric pressure. So ambient temperature, higher temperatures can be a trigger for seizures in patients with Dravet syndrome. Then we have other extrinsic triggers like light and sound, as in photosensitive epilepsies and other sound-sensitive epilepsies. Hot water or bathing epilepsy, which is a common occurrence in South India. So the relationship between epilepsy and climate change is bidirectional. Epilepsy and seizures, they lead to epilepsy care needs in the form of travel investigations, production and transport of anti-seizure drugs, education and research needs, like clinician education, patient awareness, and other research activities. And this, in one or the other way, leads to carbon emissions and finally leading to climate change. Climate change, on the other hand, impacts seizure control through effects on sleep, stress, temperature, and it also impacts other epilepsy-related comorbidities. So climate change is related to seizure precipitation. For example, stress and sleep deprivation occurring due to higher temperature and natural calamities, it can lead to precipitation of seizures as specified earlier. Then specific genetic variations in association with high temperature, high body temperature can lead to fever-sensitive seizures, and these include SCN1A, GABA-related GABA receptor variations, CSG2, PCDH19, etc. Then climate change can lead to an increase in tropical causes of epilepsy through tropical infections like neurocysticercosis, arboviruses, tick-borne infections. Furthermore, it can also lead to structural brain insults due to predisposition to dehydration, traumatic brain injury due to natural calamities. So the effect of weather and air pollution and seasonal variation has been studied in several studies. So this study from Taiwan conducted over a period of 4 years with more than 1 million medical visits, they found an association with ambient temperature and visits for seizures. And also higher methane and nitric oxide levels had a positive correlation. A similar study in children, which is a retrospective clinical observation study from Japan, although there was no clear seasonal variation found, but there was dominant peak in the fall season, and there was significant positive correlation with precipitation and methane levels. And lower ambient temperature were associated with seizure occurrence in this study. This was a study from Taiwan in more than 20-year-old subjects, and they more seizures were found on the days which had lower temperatures. So for every 1 degree decrease in temperature, there was increase in relative risk by 1.016, and temperature lower than 18 degrees Celsius had best predictive value for seizures. Similar study in children, but a long study done over a period of 11 years from Korea. So lower temperatures were associated with occurrence of seizures. So relationship between raised body temperature and seizure has been discussed multiple times, but the key factors which account for this relationship include change in permeability of native ion channels, activation of innate immune systems in the form of interleukins, and induction of hyperventilation due to leading to cerebral alkalosis, which is a precipitating factor for seizures. So although most seizures are precipitated by higher body temperatures, some seizures, specifically the epileptic spasms, they are known to resolve spontaneously after fever or infections. This has been reported in some Japanese studies where they call it as pyretotherapy, and is possibly due to higher plasma concentration of ACTH and steroidal hormones in response to stressor, including infection and fever. So besides precipitation or provocation of seizures, climate change can also add on to and impact epilepsy comorbidities in the form of higher risk of status epilepticus in temperature-sensitive epilepsies like Dravet syndrome. And there might be a possibly higher risk of SUDEP in those patients as well. And this also impacts by reducing the healthcare provision due to displacement of people because of climate change. Furthermore, climate change also impacts anti-seizure medications. So it can impact the action of the anti-seizure drugs because the channels or channels on which they are acting, they might be temperature sensitive, and there might be problems with shelf life, and there can be disruption of anti-seizure medication supply chain due to weather events. So in short, as we saw that few studies are already available, but there are limitations of these research studies. Most of them are association studies, and geographical variations have not been well captured. Most of the studies are from Japan, Taiwan, Korea, etc. And true effects and impact is difficult to assess as climate change is a gradual process. Lack of studies on genetic and genomic impacts on climate change is there. So possible solutions to this include, we should pay attention to the problem, and basic science research and population-based clinical research studies with long-term follow-up are needed to assess the impact of climate change on epilepsy. Climate awareness and mitigation strategies. And furthermore, lastly, the most important thing is that the efforts should be done by all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Priyanka, for those insightful, that excellent overview. Actually, we have some comments in the chat. People are wish they had some time to collect your the references. Maybe remind everyone that this webinar is being recorded, in fact, and it will be available very shortly, I think, as from tomorrow on the YouTube channel of ILA. So you can follow it and stop and pause and check the references. Thank you very much, Priyanka. Now it's next to Professor Anna Maria Vantini. We will show you how you yourselves contribute to the increasing much needed knowledge in the area of climate change and neurology and epilepsy. And we've heard a lot of anecdotal evidence, but now we need the hard evidence. So Anna Maria, who's leading Task Force 3 and is spearheading this survey on behalf of the Climate Change Commission. She is the head of the Laboratory of Epilepsy Therapeutic Strategies at the Mario Negri Institute for Pharmacological Research in Milan, Italy, and her main research focus on the mechanism of seizures and epileptogenesis for developing new treatments and biomarkers. Anna Maria, over to you.
Thank you very much, Janet. So my task is to briefly present you the survey that was made available to the participants of this webinar at the time of their registration. However, for those of you who have not yet filled out a survey, this is still possible for one additional week by using the link you received with the confirmation email of your registration, or the link that is posted now on the chat box. So how we developed the survey. The survey was developed through a collaboration among the 3 task forces of the Climate Change Commission of the International League Against Epilepsy. And the preparation of the survey was led by the Task Force 3 that I am chairing, that is devoted to research sustainability, with major inputs from Dr. Sarah Eyal, one member of the task force. So the major aim of Task Force 3 is to develop strategies for responsible preclinical and clinical research with reduced environmental impact. So why we developed this survey? Our intent was to develop a survey of health professionals and researchers in a broad geographic area, in order to assess their knowledge and awareness of climate change and the impacts on health, and importantly also to have a view of the actions that are already taken at the personal level in everyday life, as well as at professional and institutional levels to mitigate the impact of climate changes. So to prepare the survey, we reviewed the surveys of physicians and medical students that were previously developed on this topic and were available in the scientific literature, and we adapted the questions to the specific audience. One version of this survey is also posted on the International League Against Epilepsy website and has been disseminated among its members. So, which is the objective of the survey? Several studies suggested that the people's perception and attitude towards climate change and human health risk are indeed closely related to adaptive mitigation actions. Therefore, the knowledge of climate change is necessary for people to adapt and act appropriately. So based on this premise, the objective of the survey is to collect baseline data on 2 major aspects. And the survey is indeed composed by 25 questions, and they are mainly grouped in 2 parts. In the first part, there are questions that address the knowledge, perception, and awareness of neurology professionals and researchers about climate change and their impact on, as I said before, the everyday life behaviors, but also professional activities and, importantly, the patients. And in the second part of the survey, which adaptive and mitigation measures are perceived as necessary, again, both on personal level and at the respective hospital institute level to mitigate the effect of climate changes on health. Finally, why the survey is important in our view? Because based on survey results, education programs could be developed for neurology-related research and clinical activities to decrease the impact of these activities on environments without detracting from their quality and efficiency. So the main scope of these educational activities to make these activities as efficient and sustainable as possible. So as I said before, the survey will remain live for 7 additional days, and we do hope that you will fill out the survey because we really need this baseline data in order to plan the next step. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Anna Maria. I do encourage all the participants to fill in the survey. The work of the Climate Change Commission cannot take place, will not be as solid if we don't have the results of the survey. So that's enough. I think we've had more than enough talks for today, and now it's open to the Q&A. So I do invite the panelists to switch on their cameras again, and I will read out relevant questions as they've come into the Q&A. So you're still in time. You have some questions. We have about 10 minutes for the Q&A. So from the very interesting comments which we've had, actually one of them was from a colleague in Kenya. And he has this to say from John in Kenya. He said, our contribution to combating climate change here at URISE in Kenya is that they are mobilizing their communities in practicing sustainable farming, such as organic farming, against the use of synthetic fertilizer, and planting trees as a way to fight climate change. So they're using grafted avocados, for example, to curb food insecurity and increase household income from the sale of avocados for patients to buy drugs. And they're starting this conversation on climate change with the patients within limited resources. And it's also helped them as an organization, not only to help beat climate change, but also to demystify myths and misinformation surrounding epilepsy. So this, I think, is a very interesting perspective on the way climate change is being addressed within our communities. So another question which I thought was very interesting is this. There's a question about autism. And the question was, let me find it, let me scroll up and down again because I thought it was very interesting. It's from Kavita, and she asked, is the rising prevalence of autism related to climate change, and what may be the mechanisms? I'm not sure if perhaps Professor Calwitt or Professor Rees may have a perspective on that aspect.
I have no idea of relation between climate change and autism. What I know about autism may be linked to chemicals more than to climate change.
I'm also not aware of any particular study or something here, but of course you may speculate here only that let's say some kind of environmental factors in terms of nutrition or toxins may have an impact, but this is purely speculative.
Does anyone else have any comments on that question, Bernadette?
Yeah, with our patients with autism, it's not a direct effect like what Professor Rees and Professor Ulf mentioned. It's really more of like when it's very hot, it worsens the aggression because they don't feel comfortable and they're nonverbal. So it makes life more difficult for not only our patient, but the family as well.
Thank you. Anyone else? So over to the next question. And we actually had an interesting question from Teresa, who asked about the shopping malls. People are now going in droves to shopping malls because of the high incidence, because they're air conditioned, so they're comfortable. But unfortunately, people perhaps work in the shopping mall, and even perhaps security or police may be uneducated, and it's also dangerous. I know Stephen answered this question online. Stephen, would you like to perhaps expand on your answer, which you gave to Teresa, and read it out to our colleagues who are listening in?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think just in general, education is always a good measure to address some of these risks we're facing, whether it's heat or flooding. Having, one of the standard things we need to think about is for any risk that might come about in the future is planning for it. So having an emergency plan, thinking about what is appropriate behaviors. And I think I saw some research from the UK NHS saying that, even nurses in professional settings didn't always know what the best behavior was when you get these heat waves and to do that. So there's a mix of responsibilities. I think from a personal level, think about our own behaviors. Is it a sensible thing to do to go to a mall in a heat wave? They might have air conditioning there, as you said, but that when you travel there, that you might not be kept cool in that transport. But also on a sort of planning level, whether it be a city or the mall itself, trying to think about how we keep spaces cool in the future is a big issue, and providing facilities. Lots of cities now have particular places where people can go that they advertise when it is hot. So there's a big thing around creating blue-green infrastructure in cities that provide cool spaces for people. So I think there's a bit of education, but a bit of planning as well for these types of events. Yeah.
Great. Somebody else like to add anything else to this? We actually have a question in from Anik, who has TLE, temporal lobe epilepsy, and she's worked with patients as well in the area of neurology. And the fact that when she went on holiday to safari in Africa, she actually got heat stroke and she had breakthrough seizures. And in fact, she says that she cannot be in temperatures which are higher than 80 degrees Fahrenheit. And now she's getting seizure free, but you know the symptoms of heat stroke are getting stronger. Are there any other anecdotes of persons or patients who've had have shown the effect of this strong weather and fluctuations of health? Do you have any evidence from your patients, perhaps?
I was just going to make another point, not a clinical point, but just something we look at in climate is, and heat risk is the humidity as well. So you might have, although the temperatures might be different, as the humidity of particular location is an important factor as well. That was just the only perhaps difference between how heat in two different places might affect you.
We also see these kind of impact of warming or heat, for example, in patients with multiple sclerosis, where we have also this so-called Uthoff phenomena, where people have a worse vision, or even, let's say, the demyelinization of the nerves somehow seem to be more effective with warm weather, with warming. So we have these kind of impact of weather or warming in many disorders, and in MS or also in Parkinson's or some other disorders, it can be clearly seen in clinical practice.
Any other comments, Bernadette?
Yeah, I shared a few of my patients who had breakthrough seizures from March until this time. And one of the things we were looking at was the patency or the effectivity of the medicines, because we've been having problems with melted medicines. A lot of people in our country cannot afford to have air conditioning. It's not that they don't want it, but they just cannot afford it. And so we end up having these medicines being exposed to extreme heat. So we think that might be one of the reasons why they might also be having breakthrough seizures, besides the other things like dehydration and the actual exposure to heat.
Wallace, would like to add something? In fact, this was mentioned in one of the comments as well, that since some countries don't even use air conditioning, they're transporting patients, in one drive to try to save money, to try to make sure that they do have air conditioning, but it is actually being a problem, especially with the increase now. As you know, even in Europe, we're having a problem with heating and air conditioning, because of the huge increase in the costs of electricity. So everyone's so intent on saving on energy right now that we're kind of seeing this effect.
I was going to say, Janet, as well, the other thing to think about as well is alternatives to air conditioning as well, because obviously air conditioning uses energy, which then feeds back into the problem that we've been talking about as well. So it's difficult to retrofit buildings and things to do this, but certainly think about when we're building new buildings in the future, it's how they can be designed to keep cool in these events. And there are, architects have lots of passive, what they call passive measures that they can design into buildings to keep them cool. So I think, there's obviously a place for air conditioning, but we have to be careful that we don't see that as the only way as well.
Yeah. I think one last comment before we close and hand over to Sanjay. There's another comment on the fact whether perhaps anyone has an experience with homeopathic remedies or natural remedies with trying to prevent rise in temperature, or trying to see how that can be better addressed. Does anyone have any experience in this regard? No? So this is something definitely which will need to be studied, and definitely, as we've seen today, there's still a lot of work to be done. This is just tip of the iceberg, and we're just starting the conversation and the research. So thanks very much, and apologies for not having been able to answer all the questions in the Q&A and the very interesting interventions, but unfortunately time is pressing, and it's now time to, before we conclude this webinar, to invite Professor Sanjay Shisoza, who's the chair of the Climate Change Commission for the International League Against Epilepsy, to conclude the webinar. Professor Shisoza is Professor of Neurology at UCL University of Neurology and Honorary Consultant Neurologist at the National Hospital for Neurology and Neurosurgery in London. His areas of interest are genetic causes of epilepsy, treatment responses, and drug resistance populations. In recent years, he has been the driving force on investigating how climate change affects the epilepsies, and definitely we would not all be here today without his insights and vision in this area. Sanjay, over to you to bring this webinar to a conclusion.
Thank you, very kind introduction. And I'd like to thank all the speakers and the delegates for joining in today. And I think really showing how more and more this is becoming an area which is receiving the attention that it needs. And it's really heartening to see the recognition across different global organizations about the importance of thinking about and addressing and mitigating climate change as part of our duty of care, as part of what we do in our professional lives. So I think we've heard today a lot of different perspectives from across the world, and it's really important, I think, that we hear that, we continue to hear that, because I think the voices of the people most affected are often not heard in this discussion. So it's really good that we've had direct experience from different parts of the world where climate change has had an immediate impact. And I guess, in some parts of the world, we haven't yet seen that so much. And so it's not so much in our consciousness. It's really important that we hear that. And it's really important, I think, that we're all speaking together about this. And I hope that one of the outcomes from this really good webinar today is that we can collaborate more across our different organizations to work together on the problems that people with neurological diseases face. Because after all, in the end, we're all sharing the same planet and we're all facing the same challenges. So I'd just like to thank the WFN and the EAN and the ILE for all coming together today to make this happen. And I look forward to more discussions. And as our understanding grows, hopefully we can have more informed discussions about the science as well as about what practical actions we can take. And thank you, Janet, for organising the day-to-day and the ILE administrative staff. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanjay. Thank you all. Definitely it was a team effort. It was not easy to bring all these persons on board and to make sure we keep to the time and to actually stimulate and have this discussion on a topic which we still don't know anything about, very little about. So I'd really like to thank, first of all our colleagues on the Climate Change Commission who had a big input into organizing the agenda and discussing. Our colleagues from the WFN and the EAN who are here with us today, and even the three presidents for the support in having this webinar organized together. And of course, the technical support of the ILE staff, Catherine, Jessica, Celia, and Annabelle, who's not with us here today, who were, without them, definitely we would not be here. I would like to thank you all as well for participating and for following this webinar. I do kindly remind you to fill in. You have 2 surveys to fill in now. The normal feedback survey you receive after this webinar and the survey that Anna Maria has just described. I wish you all the rest of a good day or night and hope to see you again, who knows, perhaps again next year on the occasion of International Climate Change Day. I wish you all the very best. Thank you.
Thank you.